Good evening. Good evening, Belfast. Great. Thank you so much for inviting us to talk. I have no idea how you came to find out about pop-ups, I guess in some kind of newspaper article. But we're going to go through the story, really, and it's really interesting for us to reflect in this way with you this evening. And so thanks a lot for this. Well, the story begins back in March when the shutters came down at our office in what we call, I suppose, lockdown 1. And so we were all sent home. And on my cycle ride home, I live a few miles away from our office in Clerkenwell in London. I felt very unwell. And by the time I got home, I was sort of crawling along the floor, basically. And I'd caught the virus. And I suppose I'm lucky, and I suppose I've had a pretty easy life, friends, and not used to being unwell, bit of a sort of weak man in that sense. And so the virus really made me feel very unwell in a way I'm not used to, and knocked me out basically for around a month. And my lovely family, who you might see going past behind me in a moment, looked after me and fed me back to well-being. But there was a point where it got quite hair-raising. I didn't have to go to hospital, but the virus really took hold of my breathing and so on. I think Gabby might have a similar story, and no doubt some of you on the airways may have caught the virus as well. So we have our experiences, but whilst I was sort of gasping away, I felt, well, I'm going to get up and try and respond in some way. Surely an architecture practice can perhaps come up with a response to the situation. And so now I guess we're into the Easter period, April, May, and schools thinking about, would schools come back after the Easter break as it was then? And so would schools in England, across the UK, come back together in their buildings in June? And there was lots of talk on the radio about how this might be incredibly hard to achieve, students bumping into each other in corridors and the virus spreading rapidly. You've seen the news, and I guess that's where our thinking kicked in. And so I had a conversation with Gabby and others, Simon Bumstead in our office, about the idea of outdoor learning. And we had been seeing the Danes getting ahead, Scandinavians getting ahead on this front, and taking their children almost immediately outside into the open air. I think it's something they do more often than us in Scandinavia, Germany, places like that tend to want to take their children outside to slow down the spread of the virus. That seemed to be very good thinking to us. And so, are we going through our slides now? Yeah. So here's a slide. Denmark, first in Europe to reopen schools after coronavirus lockdown. So they very quickly got a handle on this. And we have, my partner's Danish, and I heard about this firsthand from a teacher in the family. And she said, well, why don't you get on with it? Why don't you take your children outside as well? And so I had this chat, and we started to draw the idea of a village, rather like there was news of festivals being cancelled on the radio. So rather like coming to a festival, could a school pop up on a large school site and be just like a festival with various tents of various scales and sizes, providing the accommodation? And I suppose we're going quite quickly through the slides now. We're letting all of the fireworks off, I don't know. But alongside this thinking, I was conscious, this kind of early response, I was conscious of the work of, or thinking back to the work of Shiguru Ban, an architect that I'm sure you may have heard of. If you haven't, really worth looking into Shiguru Ban's work. Because I'd seen his work going on in the 90s as a student myself. I saw his paper Emergency Center for UNHCR in Rwanda. in 1995-ish, I think. And then in the same year, the paper log houses by Shigeru Ban for the emergency response to the Kobe earthquake in Japan. And then the same houses were reused, recycled effectively, following a terrible earthquake in Turkey in 2001. He then went on to develop all kinds of interesting grid shell structures as temporary outdoor structures in a number of different uses. And so there was in the background of my mind there, you know, a clear response from an architect or an innovator that you can react to short time frames with an architecture with great effect. And so I suppose in your careers as architects, I think you're all architects. You must tell me if you're not training as architects, and then I can think about that. But we might be asked to prepare a building for 100 years. We might be prepared to prepare a building for 50 years. I suppose we should really be thinking about 100 years and not taking buildings down as frequently as we have been in the near past. But we might need to react as this situation is brought on in a very short time frame and what might be achievable. And so this initial reaction was to draw in the way Shigeru Ban did for his emergency centers, but using structures that might be available to us in the market on that day in June. And we generated this image. Okay. We generated this image alongside some plan studies, which was about reclaiming the streets and putting up sheltered environments that small class groups could meet in outside of the school grounds, stopping traffic flowing past, supplying the streets with tents, which could be classrooms, which were obviously fresh air ventilated, and which also enabled us to sort of release the pressure on the main school buildings. So take pupils out of those very narrow corridored environments and into controlled fresh air spaces. Gabby, I'm not sure quite where we are in the scheme of the slideshow, but this next drawing was Simon's response to how we might have people hand washing and going through a hygiene kind of triage process before they came onto the kind of camp, the idea of the festival camp for learning, with the big top being a kind of core of speciality subjects at the center of the field, and this kind of concentric arrangement of well-spaced general learning tents around this core of special subjects. Simon said Simon had been in the Himalaya recently, and that perhaps this movement of the pupils such that they don't bump into one another. And so rather like thinking about schools, circulation routes and so on in our day-to-day work in designing schools, that we might need to have an idea about circulation and how large numbers of pupils could circulate around the festival tents without spreading the virus unnecessarily. And so here we see this Buddhist stupa where the monks move in one direction in their prayer movement. Seems to be quite an interesting reference. Yeah, Trevor might like to say a few words here. We realized early on that in a normal general learning classroom of around 55 square meters, typically we managed to shoehorn in a rather unkind way our children into 55 square meters with 2 support teachers. And that generates, I don't know what Trevor would say, but not an unhealthy environment, but not a particularly healthy one, possibly not with adequate air changes in many circumstances. And if we wanted to space people adequately according to the guidelines at that point in time, we would only get 8 pupils in a classroom. But by taking them outside in the way we started to think, would mean that many more pupils could come into the school. Trevor, would you like to say a word there?
Thanks. Just a few words on there from a ventilation perspective. The majority of the school building stock in existence right now is, you know, a lot of it's Victorian, which is kind of leaky through the envelope, and some of the more modern ones from Building Schools for the Future program have more of a reliance on mechanical ventilation systems. So there's a real mix and match kind of in the educational school marketplace, and the modern school buildings are designed on a minimum ventilation fresh air standard, which is down to the codes and with a view on energy efficiency. But there's a lot of work being done on what is the right volume of fresh air to really stimulate learning, as aside from kind of just control the air quality. And this we're finding, we also looked at buildings in other parts of the world, in New York as well, which we'll probably come on to, Wayne, but where there's a lot of existing stock that just is not really ready for COVID to cope with the amount of air that's needed. So by looking at spacing out the desks and the ability to provide more fresh air, it looked like there was an opportunity to use the problem of the COVID pandemic as a way of actually, one, providing a safer environment, but two, providing a much more stimulating and healthy environment to really stimulate learning. And that's what these diagrams kind of point towards.
Yeah, these are early drawings, and so at this stage we're still talking, you know, around about June. We didn't know what sort of reaction this would attract. We didn't really know where we were going. We didn't have a sort of commission from a local authority at this stage or any other client. But what we could quickly see is that in looking at tents that were available on the market for such outdoor festivals, that we could take school activities, be it general learning, be it drama, library, even changing for sports and or hand washing, and then we could generate really quite interesting environments, and perhaps we could sort of suck out a year group or 2-year groups from a major school and have them going through their summer in the field. And so these drawings went up on our social media, and these drawings then attracted the interest of not just local press, but I think national press. It's true to say at that early stage, it quickly got the attention of the national press, because the national press were going through the throes of, you know, debating whether or not, you know, would pupils be going back to school or not. Of course, unfortunately, in the end, they didn't. And a lot of pupils ended up looking at screens. I think there could have been a stronger reaction to this sort of idea, and we could have got a lot more out there. And certainly what happened at this stage around about July, which was really interesting, is that providers of marquees and tents started to telephone me. And so I had a call from a guy who puts up wedding tents in the Lake District, who's actually related to one of our architects. And he said, look, you know, Wayne, this is really interesting. We're on our knees. Our business has stopped. There aren't any weddings anymore. There aren't any parties going on in the Lake District, but we've got these amazing tents, as you know. They're fabric, handmade tents in Yorkshire, made in Yorkshire. And, you know, they can be laid out over, you know, 30 meters in length. They look amazing in the field. And we think these activities you're drawing will go really well inside the tent. And well, this is fascinating. So we kept drawing, And we started to size the activities based on that provider's tents. Another call came in from a guy who called Rupert Lewis, who owns a marquee company, a very different sort of type of unit. And so fixed panels, those you might be used to seeing at, I don't know, race meetings or major festivals that are set out over a great deal of ground, that you can erect these things up to 250 meters in length and have kind of great banquets in them, or have people standing in them in great numbers. And so there's this picture of 3 or 4 people who wanted to help, who wanted to dispatch their equipment into the field and be part of this pop-up kind of response. This is one of my favorite drawings. It's an early drawing by Simon Bumpstead in our office, and he took a local school. So this is my son's school in Haringey, Fortismere. We didn't know if he'd be going back to school, and we drew this kind of village of tents on their field. Of course, they're blessed with a big playing field, but we also drew, as you'd seen in one of the slides Gabby was showing a moment ago, a response to a school on a tight urban setting, and where we might bring tents into the street, reclaim the street, stop the cars coming through. You can see the tents on the edge of the school master plan there, and use car parking areas as well, which are otherwise just sort of windswept, slightly polluted areas of school grounds. And so I think at this stage as well, the thinking around well-being and health and the link with pollution was coming out in the press as well. And so the idea of reclaim the streets also became relevant. Yeah, these are very nice renders by Dark Studios, following our sketches, where just in recognition that there could be hygiene tents, hand washing, lots of hand washing going on there. Good to see. And inside one of the tents themselves, if only a friend who's about to become the RBA president, Simon Orford, said, if only classrooms could be like this. And so that was a nice thought, but it does create a very sort of light-filled, fresh air ventilating for learning. Happened. The children didn't go back to school, but we managed to start getting some of these out into the fields. I think this is some early, what is this, Gabby? I'm sorry, guys, I haven't seen this slide.
There's some early press coverage, which spurred on the actual construction.
Okay, I didn't know about the link with the V&A. So lots of people were looking at it, and we managed to take a very lightweight tent very quickly out to a school in Tower Hamlets in East London. And this school had a lot of its pupils in-house, so they did stay open. And many of the pupils' parents, we were told, were working at the Nightingale hospital facility around the corner, hence the school staying open as the parents were on shift work, etc. And so the Manorfield School welcomed us, and we managed to put up this very lightweight unit very quickly. And so it's no great structural big deal. It's a simple tent, but there were problems that came up, or detailed challenges, and so it wasn't possible to pile pins down through the school's playground, because that would damage the playground and be silly. And so, well, what can we do? And so we got hold of some water butts, usually used for an equestrian facility, and used those to load the edges of the tent so that it wouldn't blow away. And also there was a sort of safety factor there in that detail, that such that the children would be okay to bump into them. They played with the water a little bit. The detail became a kind of an interest for the young ones as well. And one side of the tent, there might be a moment of this whole thing opening up to the school's allotment. Quite nice. This is an image that went out on national media quite quickly, which was a bit of a shame because it showed the nice children playing too closely together. They were not socially distanced, and we got all this sort of funny feedback. But the teachers were very happy because they could bring pupils out of the stuffy classrooms that were overheating already at this point, and the children were switched on by, they really liked it. And so following that early, very simple tent, we managed to get one of the beautiful fabric tents from Yorkshire onto the field at a school in another borough. And this is a sort of major secondary school. The quote there's from head teacher Paul Jackson, which is associated with the last slide. He said, "Our children have been out of school for far too long. We want to bring us back to school in as safe way as possible." And I don't know, the local authority officers, who knows what was going on internally, but I don't know if they were hamstrung or what, but there were no temporary units coming out to sites. And so as far as we're aware, these are the first off the ground, so to speak. So you see here the tent going up. There might be some slides of it going up, but it was really a beautiful thing to put up. I helped out, my family, Archie, architect, came to site to help his brother put this up in the field. And so it was a lesson, to be honest, in how to rig this thing. Oh, that's the shot I was looking for. You have these two main posts, and then laying the sheets and raising the tent. It had to be robust in the field for this 2-month commission, as it was planned then. And once it was put up, the sixth form group were able to come and use the space pretty much straight away. And so they were able to get out of the school and the difficult environment there. And so year 7 and the sixth form at this school did come in, and it just enabled them to break out, to create more space. And they really enjoyed. They were having music in the tent as well, staff meetings, all sorts of activities started to happen in this space. Yeah, and then I think, Gabby, if you wouldn't mind going back a couple of slides. One more. Yeah. Oh, one more, thanks. And so the other, yeah. So sorry, one more. The other unit there, this solid panel unit that I referred to, and so the other provider, he said, well, the Yorkshire guys have put one. Can we do one as well? And so they came to the same school and put one of their units up. You can see the guys there putting the temporary panels in place. So very robust units in this case that could stay in the field for 6 months to a year if we wanted them to. And at this stage, these are clips from, so Sky News turned up on site when we were putting them up, and they wanted to tell the story on the national airwaves, which was good. What happened next? Please jump in, guys, if you'd like to say anything about. And so it kept unfolding. Another London borough, in this case, a London borough of Brent, said that they'd like a facility which would enable pop-up dining. And so their hall was undergoing some kind of late construction works, I think at the time, problem with the flooring. And so they suddenly had this problem, that they couldn't bring the children in. And this is later on when the children came back to school, most recently. How could we get them in? How could we get a unit into the field as quickly as possible? They all said, oh, it's much nicer than our usual school hall. Yeah. So it happened then, as the story goes, that Lucia Glynn was walking past one of the school sites with her dog on an evening walk, and she noticed the tents. And Lucia happened to be the founder of a major academy trust called BMAT. And so they operate lots of schools in East London and in the county of Essex. I think around 40 or 50 schools. Lucia got in touch with us and said, you know, we love this. Can you commit to setting up lots of these on our sites? And so I think we set up on 6 to 8 sites in all kinds of different settings. And so our role as architects has been quite helpful, I think. I'm right in saying it's been quite helpful when we might have a site which is, I don't know, triangular in shape or have power lines passing it, or, you know, that you need to have an adjacency to a particular activity in the school, such as dining or science. And so a kind of degree of sensible planning and strategy comes into play there as well from our side. No idea what the next slide is. Gabby, would you like to say a little about this slide?
Well, this is just about the international press coverage. So, yeah, MSNBC stateside got in touch, and yeah, this was on the breakfast TV broadcast. So we got quite a bit of popularity that day. Quite a few messages came through, and I think one from D3, which is a group in New York, who wanted a similar pop-up to be installed in their school. So yeah, now the idea was going across to the US.
Yeah, I like the shot on the top left-hand side, which it's kind of like curtains. They treated the wall almost as a curtain to open up views to the planted area that you can't quite see in these shots. Maybe it's in one coming up, but it reminded me of one of Shigeru Ban's early projects, which is a house with over 3 stories in height, or at least a double-story space. House for a dentist, I think it was, but it had this amazing curtain wall. I mean, you know, physical curtain that you can draw over, covering the whole side of the house. And so the potential in these small structures to be really exciting from that perspective, from a material perspective, is interesting to us. What happened next?
Well, pop-up schools for a sort of triptych of ideas for the pop-up initiative. So the second being pop-up high street, as yeah, there wasn't much activity on the high street during the first lockdown, so we wondered how pop-ups could alleviate some of those issues, and also pop-up healthcare, which we will look at now. I don't know if when Trevor wants to go into a bit more detail here, because it's quite technical, but
why don't you introduce us, Gabby, because you worked on this one. Just keep going.
So it's this idea of a triage testing facility. So when patients turn up to a GP practice, or even don't turn up because they're worried if they have COVID, they don't want to turn up to the practice and give it to someone, or if they're ill at home, they don't want to turn up to the practice and contract COVID off someone. So clearly some intervention was required to test people at the GP practice, but before they go inside the actual structure. So perhaps more of a robust pop-up idea could have inside these triage testing units, whereby you enter the room, it's hygienic, it's external, so there's airflow in these barrel vaulted spaces, and if you test positive for COVID, then you don't go through into the GP practice itself, and you're sort of filtered off. But if you don't have COVID, then you can go into the GP practice. So we were thinking about materials and making it more robust than you'd seen in the school pop-ups. So the idea of timber, because timber is a natural material, which is great for indoor air quality because it's not giving off any VOCs. And on top of that, we would have natural ventilation coming through. So yeah, if you should feel confident coming into this space that you're not going to contract COVID because there's ventilation, and it's a testing facility for that. Yeah, I don't know, maybe Trevor could expand a bit more on the technical side of that. But
yeah, I think you've done a great job there, Gabby, really going through the technical side. I mean, it's important that there are kind of code minimums that have to be met from a ventilation and a thermal perspective. And, you know, that goes without saying, really, that whatever mechanical systems, or, you know, especially for winter time, we'd need to have some form of thermal control. But for the majority of the time, we can rely completely on natural systems and create a really sort of fun learning environment where I love that picture with the curtains just kind of like peeping through, how it was sort of self-regulated by each teacher. And, you know, from a pupil's perspective, if you were given a chance to stay in your classroom for the next 12 months or to go out and be in a tent for a while, I think it would be, it would be really inspiring and bring a lot of fun. And I think there's a lot of, you know, we're all sort of deeply connected in a way to temporary structures, to camping, whether it's being in a, you know, a soggy summer holiday on the coast somewhere in the UK, or you know, more of a festival or a circus or a party or a wedding, you know, whatever. The being in a tent structure just gives a different perspective, and I think it would be interesting to sort of look at the learning outcomes, the stimulation that it would bring to the pupils and the teachers as well as they deliver their curriculum in these environments.
Yeah, and at this stage, we as Gabby mentioned, we were up for looking at healthcare as well, and we talked to a lot of general practitioner groups in our work. Some we're speaking to at the moment, waiting to move out of quite a small kind of dilapidated house, early century house, and they quickly became non-operational. They couldn't have their patients in, of course, because of the virus. They couldn't have them sitting in the tiny, you know what it's like, the tiny kind of waiting room, sneezing at one another. And so as Gabby explained, we were looking for a kind of rapid modular unit which could be attractive and fresh air ventilated, and triage people through into the healthcare centres so they could be tested before they stepped over the threshold. It would be safe for them to see their GP. And so I think this idea is as relevant now in the whole process as it had been in the early summer, that now as we look forward to being actually face to face with our GPs again, well, if we're unwell anyway. But, you know, doctors like to look you physically in the eyes and, you know, take your pulse, etc., and so on and so forth. They don't want to be talking to you through Skype, I'm sure. And so we were thinking we must find a response which brings us closer, at least again, to our GPs, have face to face in that sense. And so you have this plan on the back. We did actually talk to GPs in the production of these plans. And so it became an idea for a kind of new model GP center, which could be an interesting architecture. So Kahn's vaulted gallery spaces became the device here that also carried the cheerful rainbow. But this repeat modular format could carry GP consultation booths and triage and allow people to circulate through rather pleasant planted areas. in a new model GP centre, such that if the virus struck again, then the GP centres perhaps wouldn't need to close as promptly as they had back in March and in April, that we could still continue to triage, that we could still continue to distance, that we could still continue to keep these vital services open. Gabby?
Yeah, maybe the last thing we can say is about the process and how we had to work quite rapidly when we were coming up with these ideas and getting them out to clinical commissioning groups in London. So really it was the case of Wayne chatting with GPs, coming up with some initial ideas and some sketches. And then within a day, modeling in a 3D the internal environment of the space, so that we could make some visuals quite quickly and put together the flyer and get it out all within sort of a week, really.
Yeah, these are Gabby's drawings. Very nice drawings. And yeah, it wasn't by absolutely not just me, but there's Richard Taylor in our team, Peter Little, healthcare specialist. And we were talking as well with cost consultants, Gardner and Theobald, about the how much these things might cost to actually build in the field. And we also showed it and discussed it with GPs, as Gabby says. So you can see here this guy coming in, washing his hands, and then going through to the next stage, which is the testing booths beyond, with all of the kind of NHS information being carried along those booths. But there's an opportunity for an architecture to speak to the kind of approach, entrance and arrival and passage through this system of triaging. Yeah,
so this was sort of more of a long-term pop-up initiative. As yet, we've not got any built versions of this, but we think that it's going to become quite a pressing issue as we move on and learn to live with the virus. And another area that's going to need more attention in the future is high streets. So we were wondering about how we can use the same idea from pop-up schools and transpose it into the high street realm.
I love that one, nail salon. Yeah. Keep going, Gabby.
Well, what can we say about this?
Well, we were seeing, weren't we? We were seeing restaurants coming out into the open during the summer, and then the government launched their High Street Fund initiative. But I think the government had already, pre-COVID, launched a High Street Fund to try and bring life back into the high street, to breathe life back into often redundant shops and so on. So that fund was already in place, and then came a COVID response fund to enable such activities into the high street. So restaurants, but how do you've got to shield yourself from the weather, surely, and what might the response be there? And so we drew, a number of settings, hairdressing and nail salons, all of those things we love to go to the high street for. Our colleague Fran drew this very nice study for Wembley High Street. And so we've been speaking to council officers up at Wembley. They already have plans, as so many local authorities do, which is brilliant, I think, to trap out more cars, to go to a more pedestrian environment based on life and space and not cars. And so this was a step along the way to show to the local authority how temporary structures could play a role in this kind of life and space program. Very nice drawing. So at this stage, we're beginning to pitch as well across the three sectors of education, healthcare, and high streets in parallel to try and get a response from local authority members.
These are just some of the drawings that you saw earlier, just some more examples of that. Maybe it's worth just quickly mentioning how with elderly people still shielding at the moment, and other people as well that already have pre-existing illnesses, it's still important to push forward with this idea of getting people back to high streets and getting people back to school and getting people back to their GP as safely as possible. We're in lockdown too at the moment, and maybe people are starting to adjust to buying everything online, but we don't see that as a long-term solution. So we're still trying to push for this idea and get in touch with as many local authorities as possible and see who will take it forward. I think we've just got one final slide here. Some more drawings from there.
I think from the sort of energy perspective of you know, and plugging in the utilities or water and plumbing and power in areas where there would be existing services available, especially on a school or on a high street or near a hospital or a surgery. So the ability to bring in a spur of a connection on a water pipe or a power cable or a connected drain system it's all sort of in the vicinity. Really, the light touch of these structures is that there doesn't need to be any foundations or major earthworks going on. They're literally brought in, secured in place with I really like those water butt idea to hold it down and have it like as a buffer, protective. So they can really be, you know, they're a very, very light touch. The utility on the energy side would be mainly electrical driven. We wouldn't really bring gas heaters into these tents. It would be like a heat pump system for times when that was needed. And also I think we'd looked at how could the walls of the tent be better insulated for winter time or for very cold climates, like, you know, in parts of Canada and the US, we looked at buildings there where we'd need to insulate them more in the winter time. So a very simple plug-in electrical heater and ventilation unit for when it was needed, but the majority of time to be really reliant on passive measures.
Yeah, and then we were able to lag some of those units in case, as Trevor mentioned, you were thinking about insular, then we were able to lag those rigid sided units that we showed you pictures of earlier on with layers of insulation as we got colder in the season. And some of those which are out on the BMAT sites now in Essex will be getting additional lagging over the next few weeks. What happened next? We wanted to take it a step further. Our drawings aren't really ready to show you, I guess, but two more things happen as we come to close this presentation. But we wanted to take it a step further, so we don't like temporary porta cabin accommodation for schools, which seems to be a sort of quick fit government approach to dealing with schools that are growing rapidly or might face situations like this, that the porta cabins arrive, you know, and they get stacked up on sites, often at a significant high cost. And so we wanted to develop a position which was sort of in the middle between the stacked temporary unit and a tent, a unit which could fulfill all of those positive, delightful, fresh air ventilated situations that Trevor was describing, but which could also be quite low cost and more permanent than those units we've currently got out on sites. And so we are kind of intermediate where you can have a lightweight framed structure, which is an outdoor classroom, perhaps using grid shell structure, which can be fully daylit and off-grid to deliver learning. And this is generating a fair amount of interest as well, as from some of those academy groups that we're speaking to. BMAT specifically are interested to see a costed version of that. And then we also had interest from a group called D3 in New York through, I suppose, some of the press that Gabby's been talking through. A group in New York contacted us, and you'll recall at that stage in the virus, New York really, was hit hard by the virus. And some schools in Harlem, as you know, a very poor area of Harlem, of New York, got in touch with us and said, look, can we talk to you about how you made this happen? So we did, and it happened that our UK supplier of marquees knew somebody there, and they're engaging now over the idea of getting units onto their sites. And so the conversation deepened, and we were glad to be of some help. I think their issue was really very closely related to not having any money at all. But we had some nice conversations, didn't we? How these might become sort of semi-permanent and how they might.
Especially with a city like New York, or any cosmopolitan area with different cultures. We looked at Bedouin tents, teepees, wigwams, of cultural traditions could help to inform the design. There's different community groups that sort of came together, and we were looking at maybe getting different examples of tent structures from historic cultural perspectives as well, which would be a really interesting learning tool for the community and for the students as well. So I'd love to see that sort of take off, and as well as getting creative about developing our own grid shell hybrid version too. So those porta cabins, the portables, is definitely was the sort of, we wouldn't want to really go down that direction, because they tend to stay there forever, and they never really become temporary there. They still have to have that temporary nature to the classroom, or to the triage, or the shopping shelf.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Trevor. I think that sort of brings us to the point we're currently at in with this whole response. And so I think we're at 6:20. It's point to open up to any questions you might have.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions over in the chat, and I just want to say thanks. It was super interesting to hear about how you've adapted to the pandemic. So it's been great hearing from you.
You're welcome.
Can you see the conversation over at the right-hand side? It should be along the top. You should see like show participants, and then show the conversation. If you go in there, there should, if not, I can read it out. Wayne, Trevor, I think you're on mute.
Could you read them through, do you think, Natalie? Would that be
Yeah,
okay?
no worries, I can read. I think the first one here was, how did you deal with visibility and acoustic distance challenges between teacher and whiteboard learners in the extended tents?
The challenge, could you say that one again for me, please,
Yeah.
Nestle?
How did you deal with visibility and acoustic distance challenges between teacher, whiteboard, and learners in the extended tents?
Well, I think in each of the cases there was a very different learning setting going on, and so we didn't have a response to lag the units with additional acoustic elements at this stage. We didn't make any adjustments to any visual assistance either. But what we did find is that, and the teaching staff often concurred, was that in the kind of concentric layout that we were proposing that you saw in the early tent visualization, the sight lines to the teachers were very good, and there was no really poor feedback on the acoustic environment of the tents in this case. So we can't report in detail there, I'm afraid. But I think what is going to be important that Pereira and other colleagues are involved in trying to capture responses out of all of this. And so perhaps we can have a better response to more detailed questions such as this in a few months' time.
I'd say from a lighting perspective, the fabric of the tent created a much more even light. Whereas in a regular building with windows, you quite often get intense sunlight and glare coming in. So this actually created a much more of a softer lighting feel inside, and was probably a benefit from that perspective of using if there were whiteboards, other systems were. It's much of a softer kind of ambient feel.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Did you price any of these options for pop-up shops and surgeries, etc., including energy use?
Yes, we did. We knew the likely prices of the pop-up shops from the education experience. So in engaging with the market early on in the process, so in engaging with those suppliers that I mentioned early on in the process, we quickly got to understand the sorts of charge out costs that those providers were expecting to put structures into the field or into the high street. And so, yes, we did get a very clear picture of costs. And we also developed a small fee charge of our own to help, with our own cost in all of this. Could we make a reasonable charge to some of the clients? In terms of shop installations, it's one we are excited to do. We haven't actually kind of built it or erected any of those yet. And there's a question hanging over the High Street Fund at the moment, as the government may recall that fund, we think, due to the vaccine being available, and put the money elsewhere. So we're not sure if we'll get to do the high street models yet, which is a shame. But in the healthcare model, yes, we costed that model at around £1,000 a square metre or less, possibly between £8,000 and £1,000 a square metre, which is sort of roughly a third of or half of a normal build rate, if that's useful. So when we're building a school, we might spend £2,500 a square metre. In a healthcare model building, we might spend £3,000 a square metre, possibly. And so here we were spending less than a third of typical rates in our cost analysis work.
From an energy perspective, the majority of the operations would be passive for as long as the climate would allow. And then when we did need heating or mechanical ventilation for those cold times of year, that would be delivered through a packaged unit per module. Really, it'd be sort of a plug-in unit with a ventilator, heat recovery ventilator, and a small heat pump. And so it's, in a way, that's more energy efficient than having a larger centralized, big air handling plants and boiler rooms, which have a lot of losses in distribution. By having it sort of very focused where you needed the energy, it's a pretty neat method for doing that.
Okay, next question would be, I see you suggested reclaiming car parking spaces for some of your pop-up initiatives. Do you think this will encourage the wider public to question the need for as many car parks as there are and spark more creativity in repurposing these spaces in the context of wider urban change, considering how they've helped with these initiatives in the pandemic? It's quite a long one.
Gabby's gone on mute, but I was hoping. Yeah, no, I think it's a really, all of the questions, by the way, are really, really interesting. And this one, we hope, yes, you know, we hope that, and everybody seems to be talking about it in talking to London Borough Brent before this call, about electrification, about reduced car numbers, about neighborhoods calling themselves for cars to stop traveling through their residential areas. And the perimeters of schools have always been difficult in this sense. And so, you know, we've been working on remodeling schools for a long time, you know, 30 years or something bonkers. And car parking on school sites just seems to be not the way of the future as far as we're concerned. But there should be safe passage of cyclists up to schools and walking to schools. At the moment, it's a shame. I don't know how it is in Belfast, but we see in the morning here, the children go out. You know, my son goes off on his walk to school, and it's jam-packed with cars because I think people are transporting their children around or coming to work at exactly the same time. And so that's a sort of disappointing situation, isn't it? But looking forward, I think there is a strong move to take cars away from the perimeter of schools. Certainly a lot of reclaiming of the streets in London boroughs. Discouragement of driving up to the school continues and is often banned now. So yeah, I'm sure Trevor would like to say a word about all of this.
Well, fresh air quality in the urban environment is so important to everybody's health, and you know, traffic is one of the biggest polluters of that. So anything, especially around sensitive communities, schools, healthcare centres. I was going to say nail salons, but you know, anywhere where you've got to really, you know, be careful on what you're breathing in to manage that transport and to keep a good buffer. We always talk about a fresh air reservoir. Where is our fresh air reservoir for our building? And that's where we're going to bring our ventilation from. And you know, if a car park could become a green space, then that's an ideal location for perhaps bringing in some fresher air into those environments.
Yeah, and I think what we've been saying is that we kind of put the question back to you all, that you're the designers of the future now. You know, Trevor and I at one stage were sort of pushing to get 10-20% renewable energies onto school sites in the 90s. It's over to you now, Natalie, Chloe and Gabby, to deliver net zero construction and to green our environment. So, you know, I'd encourage you all to write to your councils, to your council leaders, calling for reduced car movement, particularly around public facilities.
Yeah.
Okay. Seeing as we don't know if this is a 1 in 100 years event or more pandemic level events will become more common, it's now in schools and hospitals and such with the possibility or probability of flexible temporary expansion in mind?
Great question there, but I would say absolutely yes. You know, that buildings only benefit from more generous circulation and space provision. You know, if you look at the early century schools built in Ireland and in England, that you often have a much taller ceiling height, bigger windows, natural cross ventilation through those early century schools, and with much more generous circulation on offer in those days with lower pupil numbers. So what are we doing? Building modular schools with smaller windows, with lower ceiling heights and narrow corridors. So the answer is definitely yes, that more generous provision of space in the classroom environment, in the corridor environment, can only be a good thing for everyone.
Yeah, I'd say that we're seeing a lot of buildings requesting that they can be used for temporary shelters during pandemics or other crises. So to have flexible spaces, where a school hall could become a hospital or temporary housing. There's a view of planning for a lot of flexibility, and having the ability to plug in. Someone mentioned the utilities earlier. To plug in, spurs for power and water and drains in the grounds to accommodate these temporary classrooms or structures would be very beneficial. Wouldn't cost a lot of money to do that. It'd be very simple to do.
Okay, so that brings us to 6:30 now. So I think that's all time we have left for questions.
Think if we could even pass on the questions to you in an email and then get back to everyone with just in case we run over time here. It's the only thing. Yeah,
great.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for delivering the lecture. It was excellent. It was really good to hear your views on the pandemic and how you're approaching coronavirus in architecture. It was really interesting and very prevalent for this time. So thank you so much.
Very welcome. Anytime.
Thanks for having us.
The lecture, it'll be uploaded. We're going to start a YouTube channel, so it'll be put on there for anyone who missed it or wants to rewatch it at any stage for the question and answers. I think Sarah has her hand raised there.
Yeah, I just wondered, first of all, thank you so much for organizing that and to our guests as well. Do you guys know when your next event is going to be?
I think we have an idea that's in a few weeks' time, Sarah.
Okay, very good.
This is about the meaning of detail in architecture. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. We'll see you again soon.
Okay.
Yeah. We're gonna have
lecture. Is that the next thing? Another lecture?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's more of a sort of. Sorry, Chloe.
No, it's okay. I was just gonna say what you were saying there.
It's more of a sort of proper lecture format, but it's a lecture that I've given on a number of occasions before, and so it goes deeper into the deeper questions of architecture. This has been a little more of a sort of formal trot through and quite helpful for us to reflect.
And we're also we've also part of a network called the Global Studio through Athabasca University, and we run lectures about once a month with speakers from all around the world. So we can certainly share the link to that. They're free lectures through the architecture school over there.
Great, that's great. Well, ARCSOC, you guys, just let me know and we'll tweet about your events. It's great to see so much energy in ARCSOC this year. It's really wonderful, particularly in the weirdest of years. So thanks very much.
Thank you,
You're
sir.
welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, there we are. Well, thank you very much for everyone coming along. As I said, the link will be up for the YouTube channel once we get that sorted out, and we'll get the recording uploaded and sent over to Wayne, Trevor, and Gabriella too.
Okay, super.
Fantastic.
All right.
That's great.
Thanks a lot.
Enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone. I'm off to a planning committee. Wish me luck.
Yeah. Keep warm.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Bye.
Thank you.